The Foreign Affairs Committee is today holding another evidence session as part of our disinformation diplomacy inquiry, and our chair, Dame Emily Thornberry, is unable to attend today. She sends her apologies for not being able to hear witnesses today. But can I ask, please, that Ms. Jankovic and Ms. Braga, you introduce yourself, please, for the record.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nina Jankowicz. I am the co-founder and CEO of the American Sunlight Project, which is a bipartisan, not-for-profit in the U.S. focused on increasing the cost of lies that undermine democracy. We do actor-agnostic research on information manipulation. I was one of Time's 100 most influential people in AI in 2022. I'm an adjunct professor at Syracuse University, where I teach a graduate level course on disinformation and influence, and I'm the author of 2 books on Russian interference and online harms. I have also, relevant to this inquiry, managed disinformation research and democracy support programs funded by both the UK and the US. I'm really happy to be here with you today.
Thank you. And Ms. Braga?
Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Roberta Braga. I'm the founder and executive director of the Digital Democracy Institute of the Americas, DDIA, based out of Washington, D.C., originally from Brazil. Our mission at DDIA is to strengthen a healthier internet for Latinos and Latin Americans, and we do that through a combination of research, public opinion, and narrative research in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, capacity building, and policy work. I've held various other roles before this related to election integrity in Latin America as well. But I did spend 5 years at the Atlantic Council's Latin America Center, where I managed projects on the 2018 elections in Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, as well as some work on Venezuela related to information integrity. Thank you all for having us.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Firstly, I'd like to ask about foreign information manipulation and interference in the US. Could you outline the character of the FEMI threats to the US as you see them? And I'll pose these to Ms. Jankowicz.
Absolutely. So right now, in terms of foreign information manipulation and interference, as well as broader online influence campaigns coming from adversaries, I would say that we're seeing a back to basics from state actors as a result of tech platforms' retreat from content moderation. And I'll give you one example. In 2024, ASP, my organization, identified 1,100 likely automated accounts that posted hundreds of times a day and repeatedly retweeted overt Russian propaganda within 60 seconds of it posting. We looked back at that network right before this evidence session to see what was going on with it. And right now we're seeing that more than 800 of these accounts are still active. And to give you an idea of the volume, they have posted more than 11.1 million times in the last year on issues ranging from the war in Gaza to the war in Ukraine to the cost of living and housing crisis, not only in the US, but in the UK as well. So this network is likely controlled by Russia, by our estimation, and it is aware of the most sensitive political issues in our country. Now, this is all happening despite Elon Musk's promise to rid his platform of bots, right? And we're seeing a similar influx in other online spaces. I would also note that our strategic adversaries are doing things like grooming large language models. So they recognize that people all over the world, including in the United States, are now using large language models to quickly search and understand and synthesize information. And we found that the Pravda network, which is a collection of several hundred pro-Russian content aggregation sites, is pumping out at least 3.6 million articles a year. And we surmise that this is in order to pump the large language models, which are trying to hoover up any content that they can find online with pro-Russian propaganda. And we've tested them a number of times. And each time when we ask in particular about the war in Ukraine, events in Ukraine, the large language models, including some of the biggest proprietary models, are spitting out Russian propaganda. I would say overall, because our society is more divided right now, we have presented fertile ground to adversaries, not just Russia, but China, Iran, and any other actor that has the will to manipulate our society. Because again, that polarization is really great fuel for disinformation campaigns. I like to say that the most successful disinformation campaigns are FEMI. They're not related to cut and dry falsehoods. They are related to the ways that bad actors are manipulating and amplifying pre-existing fissures in our society. And there's plenty of examples, but I will stop there.
Super. Ms. Braga, thank you for raising your hand. I'll come to you in a moment, if I may. I did want first, though, just to ask Afra to come in on some of the points that Ms. Jankovic has made.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask a bit more about not just Russian, but also Chinese state-sponsored information operations. I mean, as you've clearly set out, Russian disinformation appears to be marked by real scale as well as adaptability and persistence, while Chinese FEMI, although can be at scale, appears sometimes to be a bit more limited by the quality of the output. I wondered, Nina, whether you could perhaps set out how you see Russian and Chinese state-sponsored information operations differing in their selection of targets, strategic objectives, and methods.
Absolutely. So in China's case, I think China is quite a bit more selective in the ways it chooses to interfere in both elections and launch influence campaigns. We know from Office of the Director of National Intelligence Assessments over the past several years, I think since 2018, that China has done a cost-benefit analysis on whether to interfere in US elections, and most of the time has elected not to. I think that is in part because their tradecraft is a little bit sloppier. It's easy to identify the networks that are coming from China, but I imagine that is going to change with the advent of high-quality large language models. This is true for all actors that are operating in a language or a culture that's not their own now because of these LLMs. Although there are some safeguards in place, I will give the companies that they are moving to try to really put up firewalls to those who might use them to implement disinformation campaigns. If you're an actor sitting in China and you don't have great English skills, now you can write a tweet or a Facebook post or what have you in perfect, pitch perfect, grammatically correct, idiomatically correct English, and also generate visual content to go along with that, and ask the LLM the best time to put that content in the world in order to target vulnerable audiences. So I would say, again, to sum up, the Chinese are a little bit more circumspect in their decisions to interfere. The quality in the past has been a little bit worse, a little bit easier to spot, a little bit more brute force, if you will, but certainly has the ability to be quite I would say impactful in the future, not only because of LLMs, but because of the sheer size and capacity of the Chinese state if it were to train that capacity on the United States, the UK, or another country.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you particularly about Ukraine and how you see Russian misinformation targeted to undermine American support for Ukraine.
Yeah, I actually did a project with the Center for Information Resilience not too long ago. They're based in London. And in 2022 and 2023, we were already seeing erosion for Ukraine in the United States, erosion of support for Ukraine in the United States. And that was in part due to Russian amplification of narratives about Ukrainian corruption, about the history between Russia and Ukraine and how Ukraine actually belonged with Russia. And we actually saw the repeating of some of these narratives in Congress itself. And that's one thing I wanted to bring up before as well. Information laundering, I think, is a threat to democratic societies, not only the United States, but I'm seeing it in the UK quite frequently as well. And this is when a foreign actor identifies an authentic local voice in the dialogue in a specific country, introduces a narrative to them, perhaps in their X feed, perhaps through meetings or lobbying, and then that narrative is laundered into official business, like a hearing like this, or perhaps someone goes and does a hit on TV. So that's the way that we see a lot of this pro-Russian disinformation making its way into the U.S. political discourse, all the way up to the highest office of the land, the Oval Office, as we saw during the very fateful Oval Office meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky.
Mm-hmm. I wondered whether, Phil, you wanted to ask anything further about China?
Yeah, I just had a quick question for Nina Jankovic about China. The briefing I read before this session spoke about the increasing use of private commercial firms to disseminate foreign information manipulation and interference. I was wondering if you could talk more to who these private firms are and why there seems to be increasing use of privatized FEMI.
Yes, this is something that we've seen not only for China, but in many other nation-state actors, including Russia. My conjecture is that these firms are being hired in order to get around the detection and mitigation tools the platforms have in place. Russia has, of course, done this with PR firms in Africa. It's attempted to hire influencers in France through PR firms, and even set up a carve-out media organization here in the United States, staffed by 2 Canadians. So this is a way to outsource these sorts of operations and evade detection. And I assume that China and Iran are doing this as well. These firms, I would say, are more focused on income and profit rather than moral scruples that others of us might have. And so introducing, if there are not any already, know your customer principles for public relations firms, particularly those that are operating at a mass scale, I think could be an interesting way to mitigate those harms.
Ms. Braga, I'm going to come on to Latin America in a minute. We've been joined by John Bateman, the Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I wondered, firstly, whether, Mr. Bateman, you could introduce yourself for the record, please.
Thank you, members, and I apologize for a catastrophic time zone miscalculation. We'll blame ChatGPT for this one. My name is John Bateman. I work at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where I co-lead our technology program.
Edward, do you have any questions that you'd like to pose to Mr. Bateman?
I don't, but I would like to go back to a point that Ms. Jankovic was making, which was that you mentioned that Russian FEMI has been successful in some cases in penetrating the political discourse in the US and the UK. You mentioned the meeting in the Oval Office. I thought, given we have your expertise here, when we're looking at the UK, do you want to identify any British actors that you would say have been successfully captured by Russian misinformation?
Well, I have certainly seen a lot of Russian rhetoric coming from Mr. Farage, and I don't think that's going to be a surprise to anyone in this room. And I would say his narratives about Ukraine converge also with the Trump administration's narratives. And there's also convergence on fighting disinformation. And I think we'll get to that a little bit later on, but just to kind of preview it, certainly Mr. Farage seems to be an important ally of the Trump administration's in tearing down counter disinformation programming, not only in the UK, but in the EU as well.
Thank you. Mr. Bateman, are there any recent developments in Russian or Chinese state-sponsored FEMI that are of particular concern, do you think?
I would say the general direction for both Russia and China is continued dedication to the tool, and with China in particular, an increased boldness and volume of activity. China has become more sophisticated over time. It has more taken to mimicking some of the efforts that Russia has traditionally been associated with in the past, involving investing in the development of online personas that can be used at a later date. China also has a great amount of volume that they bring to this. It does concern me as an American that China, as of 2016, was not intervening in U.S. elections substantially, and I think that has gradually changed. And so that just shows you some of the increased willingness of these actors to take action.
Okay, thank you. Sam.
Thank you. My question is to Nina. Nina, you mentioned earlier the fertile ground that there is in terms of tackling, well, in terms of tackling FEMI. So my question is, at the moment, that there isn't any official organisation in America. So what is the main US agency and body that's countering FEMI against the threats that you've mentioned?
I would say, ma'am, that there isn't one. We have unilaterally disarmed in the fight against FEMI and against falsehoods more broadly. As you know, the Global Engagement Center was dismantled in a bad faith campaign that labeled its work to expose FEMI as censorship. And as I understand it, the GEC's activity and investment in that space was larger than the FCDO's entire investment there. So that's a pretty big hole. Other offices have also been either cut back drastically or completely dismantled as a result of the censorship lie. That includes the Office of the Director of National Intelligence's Foreign Malign Influence Center, the FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force, and work on mis and disinformation at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security, where people have been either fired or reassigned. And it looks like as of the next fiscal year, that budget for countering mis and disinformation related to election and infrastructure at CISA will be completely eliminated. And that's, of course, in addition to the gutting of USAID, which supported these programs abroad, as well as, investments in media and resilience building program, and in addition to the shuttering or kind of stop work order at Voice of America and RFERL. So as I see it, and I'm not sure if my co-panelists would agree, but I'd venture to say that they would, the pressure right now, the work in countering FEMI is mostly coming from civil society, which is beleaguered and underfunded and under a lot of pressure, harassment, and threats because of the work that we have done.
Who does the harassment and threats come from?
Well, you may know a little bit about my personal background, but I briefly served in the Biden administration doing work to make our counter-disinformation policy at the Department of Homeland Security. And just to give you a little bit of my personal experience with this, for the past 3.5 years, which is the entirety of the time my son has been alive, I was pregnant when I was at DHS. My family has been dealing with severe threats, death threats. We were doxxed and as a result had to move our residence. I had a cyber stalker. There's also legal threats and lawfare against many of the organizations and people in our field in the United States. And a lot of people, surmise or suggest, those who believe in this idea that myself and my colleagues are censors, that we have committed treason. And in the United States, of course, one of the punishments for treason is death. So you can kind of make a logical conclusion about where things go from there. But it has been a really trying 3 years. That being said, I think the fact that we're all here at 5:30 on a Wednesday morning. Is it Wednesday? It's Tuesday, isn't it? On a Tuesday morning, I think belies our commitment to this cause and our belief that this work is more important than ever.
Thank you. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you. That is extremely concerning to hear, and I'm sorry for all that you have endured through all of that. Just for a US citizen or for our constituents here in the UK, maybe this is for John and for Nina, but what would you say is why people should be concerned about foreign information manipulation and interference? What is the impact on the ordinary person in the street?
Go ahead, Nina.
No, John, go please.
I think first and foremost for me, it's a violation of the boundaries of a democratic fair play. Most countries have some kind of norms or laws about what is considered legitimate participation in the democratic process involving foreign actors. In the US, for example, we tolerate foreign actors offering their speech under the First Amendment, but not offering campaign contributions. And there's a growing norm, certainly, against kind of inauthentic behavior and covert action by foreign governments. So it's a violation of that norm, first and foremost. I would actually just say it's a foreign policy problem. It's unfriendly, hostile behavior by outside actors. But I would also add that if we're worried about the actual tangible practical effects of this, we don't really know. I mean, obviously, there's the human element. People like Nina are suffering because of the second and third order consequences of foreign disinformation. But there isn't strong empirical evidence that the kinds of social media-based campaigns or false personas are actually affecting electoral outcomes or having large-scale effects on national politics in major, relatively stable democracies like the UK.
I see Roberta's got her hand up and she hasn't had a chance to come in. I'm sure she has some great things to say. So I'll just defer to Roberta for right now.
So I did want to add something because for the last 2 years at DDIA, we have been doing a lot of research in the United States, specifically with Latino communities. There are about 68 million Latinos in the US from a variety of different places, some English dominant, some Spanish dominant. And to John's point, we've actually approached trying to measure the impact of misinformation and other online harms on Latinos using public opinion research. So we brought 15 false claims and 7 conspiracy theories, put them in front of over 3,000 Latinos over in March of 24 before the elections, in September of 24, the month before the elections. And we were actually able to see that a lot of these misinformation narratives, especially the ones related to elites and institutions, which exacerbate citizens' distrust in government, in each other, and in the processes of democracy are taking hold. So to give you an idea of the many different narratives that we tested, the 2 that were penetrating the most had to do with elites and institutions. And they were, one, that there's a deep state composed of shadowy political figures that's working against the public. 54% of the people that we tested had seen this narrative, and 42% accepted it to be true. And the other was that elites are plotting with social media companies and mainstream media outlets to hide the truth from us. 54% of the 3,000 plus people had seen this narrative, and 47% accepted it. The other effect that we've seen is that these actors are also helping to cement the degree of uncertainty and skepticism in absolutely everything that at least Latinos are seeing on the internet. So to give you a sense, in March, 62% of the 3,000 plus people in the poll told us that they were either rejecting some of the claims or they were unsure if they were true or false 100%. And that percentage was 66% in September. So I think that even more than belief, we should increasingly be worried about uncertainty and skepticism because people are very much trying to navigate this pollution with little tools and resources, and that is having an effect in how they engage with politics and democracy as well. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Thanks, Ms. Braga.
If I can just add one final thought on why, the common man or woman should care about foreign information manipulation and interference. We all want our vote to count, right? And although John pointed out good data about the effect of FEMI campaigns on individual elections, I still think people want to be able to make decisions based on accurate information. They don't want to be, pandered to or lied to. And they want to go cast a ballot and know that ballot, and I'm not talking about, cyber exploits here, but they want that ballot to be based on fact, and they want it to matter in our democracy. And so I think when you've got actors masquerading, whether they're from, China, Russia, Iran, or other countries, as Americans and trying to lead individual Americans astray, or Brits or other countries, right? This is fundamentally at odds with our democratic rights to access information and to use that information in our democratic, responsibilities like casting ballots.
Do you have any other questions that you would like to pose?
Yes, thank you, Chair. The G7, to Nina, the G7 established the rapid response mechanism in 2018 to detect and respond to threats to democracy, including hostile foreign information manipulation interference attacks. How would you assess its effectiveness, and has it improved resilience against such threats?
I would say that my assessment of the G7 RRM is rather tepid. I think it is good as an information sharing structure and has brought together, powerful countries to discuss these threats, usually on the margins of G7 summits. But in terms of being rapid or even responding in a really concrete way, I don't think it's met those goals. And that is in part because of the political machinations at play. For the G7 RRM to even put out a statement on these issues, they need consensus from all of the countries involved. And as a result, that means that they often don't even put out statements on this stuff, particularly now, as one of the G7 countries, my own, the United States, has gone completely cold on these issues. And we're seeing some other countries leaning that way as well. I think, this is, again, a good working level information sharing tool, but that's about it. And in order to make it more effective, I actually think moving it further away from government and giving it more political insulation, perhaps making it an arm's length entity so that it's not as impacted by political changes in each capital, would be a good way to make it more effective. And then in general, just thinking more about the ways that the countries involved can use the pointy end of the stick and not just do attribution and detection. That's all great, but when you're not actually making sure there's any impact on the strategic adversaries that the G7 RRM is set up to counter, then you're just kind of shuffling papers around, unfortunately.
Thank you. Depressing but helpful.
That's right. We're going to think a little now about foreign information manipulation and interference in Latin America. Edward.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Braga, thank you for your patience. Latin America is obviously a large geography, so perhaps at a very macro level you can just start by telling us who are the main actors that are looking to use FEMI in Latin America? What are their main targets within Latin America?
Thank you so much for the question. Yes, I think in this case, we're treating Latin America as a unit, but as we know, it's very nuanced and complex. There are three sets of actors per country. So I would say Russia, China, and Iran are the three that we've kept the closest eye on. But they all have three buckets, I would say, of influencers in the region. The state-backed news media outlets, state-backed, state-funded, local influencers and proxies that often parrot some of the same official narratives, in some cases even academics as well. And then I would say there's the soft power arm, and I'll talk a little bit about that. In Russia's case, we've seen that RT in Espanol is one of the biggest outlets with penetration in various countries in the region. In Brazil's case, it's actually Sputnik Mundo. So they've thrown a lot of resources behind Portuguese language version of Sputnik there. And in Iran's case, we've seen Hispan TV be one of the main actors, and they're producing Spanish language content across countries in the region. Both of these networks also have a large penetration among Latinos and Spanish speakers in the United States. As I mentioned, our communities, Latinos and Latin Americans, are incredibly connected across borders, and often the narratives that we see these actors pushing drive at local divisions, but the movements and the narratives are often cyclical and they're borderless and they get recycled over and over. And where we see the changes happening are often in the specific claims inside of each country that are used to underpin some of those meta narratives or false stories that get told. I would say that these three sets of buckets of actors, the state-funded media outlets, the proxies and local influencers, and then the soft power arm, often harness, I would say, a history of skepticism about the global powers, specifically the United States. They are often trying to push the multipolar world order view and using some illicit methods to do so. But I would say that as far as who they're targeting, there's a large, I would say, percentage of the population in many Latin American countries that do believe that their countries should have a more prominent seat at the decision-making table around the world, that the degree of influence the United States and other global powers have over their realities and their lives is unfair, and that a multipolar world order or a multi-stakeholder world order is the future of geopolitical influence. Countries like Brazil, where I'm originally from, oftentimes espouse that also as sort of the official approach to diplomacy and democracy. And I would say that these country actors know that and often try to harness that to advance their own agendas in the countries.
How is that feeding into, individual countries' relations with their neighbours or with the US or with other powers?
So it's hard to say whether these narratives are changing official practice, but I can give you a few instances where I think that their influence, or at least their interference in the conversation online, might have had an effect. So looking backwards, there were sort of three instances. One was elections in, I would say, Brazil and Colombia, specifically in 2018, in the 2018 context. We saw the election fraud narrative, that elections are fraudulent and can't be trusted, appearing in both of those countries in unique ways. It's something that we see in the United States as well. And in those cases, we did see these actors sort of amplifying the suspicions that people had. In Brazil's case, it was often that the voting machines that Brazil uses are being hacked or are untrustworthy or aren't generating the numbers when you type in the number of the candidate, which is what you're supposed to do there, aren't generating the votes reflective of that. In Colombia, we saw Sharpie Gate, people affirming that the type of pen that you were using on the ballots was misguided or erroneous, or that the ballots were somehow being manipulated. And we saw these actors amplifying those suspicions. During COVID-19, I would say that the actors came in to amplify suspicions of anti-vaccine suspicions, and also to position themselves as being providers of solutions where maybe the United States was taking a step back. And then lastly, I would say often these actors exploit local countries' moments of social unrest. And as we've had a lot of instances in Latin America of social unrest in I would say in the last 5 to 10 years. An example of that was the Chilean 2019 protests. We saw these actors amplifying some of that. I think looking forward, where we've already begun to see movement in the narrative building from Russia and Iran and others is, I would say, one, eroding trust in democratic institutions. So in Brazil's case, in the STF, the Supreme Court, especially after Judge Alexandre de Moraes and other members of the court took a stronger position following our January 8th, 2023 protests that mirrored the US's January 6th, 2021 protests, to take down accounts that were spreading election fraud lies, but took it, I would say, a little further than usual. They really became a scapegoat and were attacked massively, and I would say these actors sort of fit in there to create division as well. I would say that now that Brazil is taking more lead in the BRICS and building the BRICS movement, we see Russia, Iran, and others sort of promoting their own geopolitical goals by saying that BRICS is an alternative to imperialist power. And then lastly, I would say, and Nina mentioned this, that as the United States takes a step back from engagement with the region, or in this case, when they prioritize the local immigration agenda and take more of an animosity tone, which we often see coming out of, for example, White House social media accounts and official rhetoric, where they're attacking countries to assure that those countries' citizens don't migrate to the United States. As they take that position, they leave a massive gap, and China and Russia, I would say, are stepping in to position themselves as better trading partners, to position themselves as a place where perhaps foreign student or US students or foreign students from Latin America might be able to go if they can't go study in the United States, for example, or where refugees and asylum seekers might be able to find some safety or refuge if they can't stay in the United States.
And to what degree is, the narrative that's coming out of the US, the current US administration, playing into the hands of the desired policy outcomes of those malign actors that you're seeing in Latin America? Is it supportive? Is it all part of a bigger game of checkers that we're seeing?
I would say it's definitely part of a bigger game, and one that's hard to measure. I think in some instances, the United States takes a position of supporting local leaders. So, say in the case of Javier Milei, with the amount of money that was given to Argentina to help its economy bounce back, that might be seen as, a hand given to the region. But then in other cases, you see the United States really taking a position of demonizing these countries writ large if their people are migrating to the United States at any sort of scale. And then I think, as we're seeing now happening with Venezuela, as the United States sort of takes a stance of potentially considering interference or government change or regime change, in this case in Venezuela, that will have an impact in other countries in the region. I think that could also create an environment that might, for some people in Latin America, be reflective of past instances of US interference in the region. And even though the discussion around Venezuela is incredibly complex, I do think that countries like Russia, China, and Iran know how to harness that history to create further division. And oftentimes what we see is that they are fueling the narrative on multiple sides of the political aisle in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And I would say that in the right, both the right and the left, you see some involvement of these actors. So I think, if anything, it's just creating that higher degree of distrust, more polarization, more uncertainty, and more emotional, sensationalistic sort of engagement on social media.
Any more, Edward?
I don't know if you want to speak to anything at a sort of regional actor level. You mentioned Venezuela, but Nicaragua or Cuba or anything like that, and whether or not individual countries are getting support from foreign actors, in order to pursue their own local goals.
Yeah, so I would say that at least online, we've seen the Maduro regime, Cuba, and a few others getting support from Russia and Iran. So, for example, in the case of Hispan TV, the network, the Iranian state-funded network that I mentioned, we see them positioning the discussion online to sort of reflect a heroes versus villains dichotomy, where the anti-imperialist bloc that comprises Venezuela, Cuba, in this case, Palestine, and then they bring in Iran and Russia, are sort of framed as the righteous defenders, the resilient defenders of our human rights, or of power in the region. And then the predatory empire being the other side's position, in this case, US and Israel, sort of framed as failing, as corrupt, aggressive, as Nazi Zionist. And so there's really, I think, a cycle of amplification that happens between the Maduro regime, Venezuela state-funded information outlets, and then the information outlets that are funded by states like Iran and Russia and China. And that they create that sort of pitting. To give you an idea, for Hispan TV, our team did a look at their engagement rates between, it was last week, November 11th and 13th. And in those 3 days alone in Spanish, 55 articles were posted on their website, 42 unique Telegram messages were posted to public channels, and then around 90,000 views on their website on average per month were coming from Venezuela, Colombia, and Mexico. So I think that you see them simultaneously being sort of an instrument of Iranian foreign policy, harnessing some of the Russia FEMA playbook that Nina mentioned, but then also amplifying and giving fodder to the positions of some of these other regional actors like Venezuela and Cuba.
Bill, do you have anything that you would like to ask Ms. Braga?
Mention was made of soft power earlier in Latin America as exercised by Russia and China. Are you able to talk, Roberta Braga, to what Chinese and Russian soft power in Latin America looks like and how it's characterized?
So I can give an example of this, and I would actually then I'll send supplementary materials after, because the organization that we're working with on this is based out of Brazil. So in the Brazil case, one example of this is the Bolshoi Ballet. They have made inroads in the country, I think 14 different ballet auditions in the last few months. And so I think they're really harnessing sort of the everyday person's desire for culture, for entertainment, for escapism, to position themselves as sort of an alternative to that. That's one example. I would say another example is the education example that I mentioned. Russia and Brazil have a different diplomatic relationship than Russia has with other countries around the world. It's less, there's less animosity and more of a history of neutral diplomatic engagement. And I think Russia sort of harnesses that to position themselves as a place both where tourists can go, where students can study, and then where people can learn the language. I would say in the Brazil case, the United States still remains sort of the pillar of cultural admiration, I guess you could say. But it's also now become a place where, because of a lot of the Trump administration's positioning, it's also a place that people look at in some cases with disdain, depending on what side of the political aisle they're on. Around the protests on September 7th, which is Brazil's National Independence Day, we saw that some people went to the streets in Brazil carrying an American flag, an American and Brazil flag combined in some cases, where they were sort of taking the Trump movement in stride with their own Bolsonaro-backed movement. And all of the narratives that we mentioned, including election fraud, for example, is something that they really cling to. And in other instances now, the United States in Brazil is looked at as sort of an incredibly bad actor that is creating a lot of uncertainty in the region, that can't be trusted as a trade partner, and that is very irresponsible. So I think that there's some polarization being created as well with these global powers, and Russia, China, and Iran know how to kind of, again, dive into that to exacerbate the divisions.
Sadly, we're up against it time-wise, but thank you each of our panel members for giving evidence this morning at really a very early o'clock in the United States. Thanks very much for getting up to join us. If you've got other evidence that you do want to give, then please write to the committee with any further thoughts that you wish that you would said today or that you want us to reflect on. Otherwise, we're going to suspend the sitting to switch witnesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Order.
Thank you.
Thank you. The committee is very grateful to the Brazilian Embassy for sparing the time to give us evidence today. I expect you perhaps heard that we don't have our chair, Dame Emily Thornberry, today. She gives her apologies. But I wondered, could you please introduce yourself?
Of course. Good morning, members of Parliament. My name is Alexandre Brazil. I'm the Deputy Head of Mission at the Brazilian Embassy here. I have a diplomatic career going back from 1998. And I stand degree in computer science, and I have been in different moments of my career following subjects related to tech. And like I have been our science desk at UNESCO. I work at the press office twice, so I'm well positioned to talk about what we're doing in the field of disinformation, misinformation. If I may start.
Well, Mr. Brasil, I just wanted to say we've only got 15 minutes for this session, but we are fascinated to hear more about disinformation in Brazil. So I would like first to ask Abdesam if she has any questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Brazil. So Brazil has been at the centre of the debate surrounding disinformation and online platforms following the judicial dispute with X. Can you outline more about the dispute and the types of disinformation that were actually identified?
What happened during the X controversy? It was a lot of fluff. Lots of people didn't understand exactly what happened. It was basically the application of the law. We had a law that was approved by the Congress that allowed the Supreme Court to ask for the suspension of accounts that are clearly and provenly spouting misinformation, in that case about the elections. What the Supreme Court did was to place a fine, as the law was supposed to do, was allow him to do. And because Twitter didn't have any kind of office to receive the fine, it was suspended. And after some time and some discussion and a lot of, misinformation also on the subject, the company actually placed someone there, and the fine was given, and the X or Twitter is working perfectly fine in Brazil right now. I would like to stress it's not a government policy. It was not a decision by the executive branch of the government. It was actually a consequence of a law approved by the Congress and applied by the judiciary system, as it should be done with any kind of company, any kind of field.
What kind of activity were they involved in Brazil? So
there are accounts actually saying things of what have been said here about the frauds in election, the problems with the electoral machines, and things that were unsupported, and that was proven to be false, and there was a request for the suspension of the accounts that were not accepted by the company.
Has that experience with X, has that influenced now the broader regulatory reforms towards various other online platforms?
Oh, the law is there. It's something that we need to apply. There's a high bar of this to do this kind of things. So it's not something that people do willy-nilly, but the law is still in place. We have now recently approved a more stringent law regarding the young people, children and adolescents that are supposed to enter into force next March next year, following a very strong popular movement against what they've been called it's a very, I don't know how to translate that in English. It was like to making children adults before their time. So there was kind of a work on trying to avoid this kind of content that is appropriate for adults to children, to direct to children and teenagers. So there's this new law, but the older law about the spouting misinformation and the fact that there is some responsibility of the companies to avoid and to this kind of misinformation and to act on that, it's still there.
So you said that X is now functioning in Brazil, so it's back to normal. So how do you respond to people or organisations who may criticise that what happened could undermine freedom of expression, freedom of speech?
But freedom of speech is always a very difficult matter. But what I would say is that we have a law that was very approved by the Congress. And the matter of freedom of speech does not include the right to say lies. And as long as there is a very strong rule of law and a very strong way of making sure that what you are doing is fighting misinformation and blatant lies and not opinion, I don't think that can be construed as a form of censorship. The matter is how you do, as with anything, is if you have a strong institution, a strong judicial system that is capable of actually looking into the content and looking and say, no, that this is blatant law. You can say the sky is red, sky is blue. So you should be aware of that. Of course, if you say that you should paint all the sky red, you use some sort of technology to do so, that's an opinion, that's something that should not be restricted.
Mr. Brazil, I mean, you've offered there a very hypothetical example, but I wondered if you could give some actual examples of the sorts of disinformation that have been identified in Brazil.
Brazil is not different from all the countries in the world. We experienced a lot of misinformation during the pandemics, regarding the vaccines. We had specific matters of disinformation regarding the elections. It's not dissimilar of what has been happening in different countries of the world. In case of Brazil, because we have this very peculiar system of machines that are electronic, there was a specific, like Brazil, a specific kind of misinformation saying there was these machines could be hacked or were hacked. There was some sort of things going on, but it's similar to things that have been going on in different parts of the world.
We were grateful to have you sitting at the back during the first panel, and so you will have heard the evidence presented by Ms. Braga. Did you agree with the comments that she made, perhaps?
What I can say about that is that we don't identify in Brazil as much as a foreign manipulation exercise as much as there is a domestic environment of creating misinformation. So that's something that I would say that's our own. I don't know what's happening in other countries in the region, and I'm not in a position to talk about other countries here. But what we have been receiving information in Brazil, there's a very active environment of people in Brazil that are working with misinformation. That's something that we try to fight against. That's basically what I would like to say, and also that we try to, it's our diplomatic tradition to try to keep a dialogue open for all the countries, and we don't think that's appropriate to singularize countries in different ways about that. We have to engage in dialogue. It has always been the Brazilian way to do foreign policy.
Can I just ask on that? So that political non-alignment, does that prevent you from identifying misinformation, disinformation when it happens and it's attributed to other states?
No, of course not. As I said, the question of misinformation is a question of facts. The fact is wrong, you have to do, and you must remember that there's not only, there are different countries spouting misinformation. There is not only the countries that say mentioned here. Mm-hmm. So we are trying to deal with the matter domestically. We're also trying to do this matter of different actors in the foreign arena. And we are trying to talk with everyone. We have been talking about that with BRICS. We have talked about that in the UN. You have talked about that in G20. Our president G20 approved very strong declaration on that. The BRICS has a very strong declaration on that. Our presidents of COP30 just approved a very active and a fund to combat disinformation on climate change, for instance. So there is a lot of things that we are doing, and we believe in very strongly that the way of doing that is not to name and shame, but to engage in dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we heard earlier that America has closed the Global Engagement Center. What function does Brazil have to tackle FIMI?
Brazil is not the home of the companies, so it's the countries that are supposed to have the headquarters of the companies that are hosting misinformation are the ones that can have more leverage on them. What we're trying to do is trying to apply the law of Brazil in the Brazilian territory and trying to make people realize that they have to be more careful about what they read and how they interact with the internet. There's a lot of education that needs to be done as well. But the fact that the decision of the United States government is not something that I can comment on here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah. So just following up on that, so is there a unit within the Brazilian government that deals with this? And
yes.
And from your experience, what makes that effective in identifying the foreign disinformation? And you were talking about, and we heard from the panel before, about foreign malign actors masquerading as local citizens. We were talking about America and the UK, and how difficult that is to disentangle. And has the Brazilian government unit found the same, that it's hard to disentangle where these threats are coming from?
There's different organs that are doing this. We have a Secretariat for Digital Policies created to respond to these threats, and we have a specific, because Brazil has a specific organization for elections. We have a specific tribunal that deals with elections, and they deal with this kind of misinformation that's directed to elections and to reduce the confidence and the trust in our electoral system. And we have some specific parts in the judicial system that are working on trying to identify that and trying to work with the companies as well, so we can try to reduce the amount of lies and disinformation that's going on in the internet. As we all know, it's an ocean of things happening. It's very hard to keep track on that. But there are people that are working on that. I have recently the visit of our national data protection national agent, sometimes we have to invert the names in Portuguese, was here talking with Con about the experience of Con on how to deal with teenagers and children, for instance, online. And the online world now touches every part of our lives. So it's at the same time you have to, as a government, to try to think about ways to do that in different realms. It's not one organ that is going to deal with that. You have to have a whole of a government approach on this.
Abdisan, do you have any other questions on climate?
Yeah, one more final question. During his opening speech in COP30, President Lula warned that we are living in an era of fake news and misrepresentation. What forms of climate-related disinformation does the Brazilian government consider might be most harmful to the international climate cooperation?
I understand that what our president said in the COP30, in the beginning of COP30, was directed to the misinformation on climate change. That was one of the main obstacles we have today to deal with the danger of climate change, that climate change represents for our lives. And that's why we have been working throughout this year on the idea that we need to work on information integrity on climate change. We have the Declaration on Information Integrity on Climate Change that was signed recently by 12 countries in COP, and we hope the United Kingdom may join us as soon as possible on that. We are also creating not only the commitment, the written commitment, but also try to create to engage researchers and engage people that are trying to identify from whence this kind of misinformation comes and try to combat that. And that was the thrust of what our president was saying in the COP30 presidency.
Thank you. Good job.
Super. Well, unless anyone else, any other members of the committee have got any questions, I think that's us. Thank you very much, Mr. Brazil, for coming across London today. If there's any further evidence that you wish to give the committee, then please put it in writing. Otherwise, we will suspend the sitting to change witnesses. To our final witness today, Mr. Lalwani. If you didn't hear earlier on, Dame Emily Thornbury, who typically chairs the Foreign Affairs Committee, is away today and sends her apologies. Could I ask you to introduce yourself for the record, please?
Yes, I'm Nishant Lalwani. I'm the CEO of the International Fund for Public Interest Media.
Super. Thank you very much. This session is going to consider global media freedoms, and firstly, I wanted to ask about, in quite broad terms, what is your assessment of media freedoms globally, and how has that changed recently?
Well, I think, all the data shows that media freedom has been declining over the last 13 to 15 years, and I think that's primarily for two reasons. One is that there have been more attacks on journalists, the rise of autocratic leaders around the world who have the same playbook of trying to undermine trustworthy independent media and journalists and replace trustworthy journalism with their own narratives. It's a very cost-effective and kind of impactful way of allowing propaganda to thrive and allowing autocratic power to consolidate. So I think that political tactic has been used everywhere from the Philippines to Georgia to other states. And then the second reason is that there's been economic crisis in independent journalism. And that started with the dot-com era and the attention economy, with advertising revenue moving away from newspapers and other sources of journalism to the tech platforms who redirected it to entertainment and other sources of content. We've seen independent media go through what the UN Secretary General called media extinction in many countries. So I believe in Brazil we've lost almost 1,000 media outlets in the last 10 years. Even in the UK, I believe we've lost more than 250 news titles in the last 15 years. And of course, when you leave that gap, you can have theoretical media freedom, but you don't have news outlets actually reporting in a pluralistic, fact-based way on what's happening in their communities. So you have media freedom in theory, but not in practice.
And you talk about that over the span of the last 10 to 15 years, Mr. Lalwani. What about more recently? What about in the last few years?
Well, I think those trends have accelerated. For example, there's a number of factors leading to that, but one of the factors is the lack of...
All right, please carry on.
No problem. The lack of funding available for independent media. So we estimate that just, with OECD data, that are, just 0.2% of all foreign aid is actually spent on supporting independent media. With all of the cuts that have come recently, obviously USAID in January, but also the cuts around Europe and here, that there's going to be much, much less money available to support trustworthy journalism. And that has had a massive impact on, already in Eastern Europe, for example, our grantees at the International Fund have seen a 50 to 70% decrease in the funding available. In Latin America, it's between 15 and 40% decrease since the beginning of the year. So this is happening now, and happening very, very rapidly, and there doesn't appear to be any states or foundations that are seriously considering stepping up to fill these gaps. The other factor, of course, is technological progress. I think Nina earlier did a great job of explaining how LLMs are being groomed by disinformation networks. Another way of looking at the problem is that if you look at the large tech companies, they have done certain deals with media organizations like Reuters and the Associated Press, Axel Springer, to bring in trustworthy news data into their LLMs. Those deals are almost all in English. Some of them are in French and Spanish, one or two in German. Sorry, not in Spanish. I don't think there are any in Spanish. There are none in Portuguese. There are none in Hindi. There are none in Swahili. There are none in Bengali, other really enormous languages. And so what you find is that the quality of training and grounding data for LLMs in non-English languages is appalling. And the rate of misinformation and disinformation that's coming through LLMs, which are, of course, increasingly the way that people search for information, either directly or through, even through AI news summaries. The quality of disinformation there and the volume of disinformation there is much, much higher in non-English languages. And that's providing a really, via the Pravda network that Nina mentioned and others, a really easy way to actually spread propaganda or undermine media freedom.
Just before I bring Afra in, can I just ask about the languages that are used for training the models? Mm-hmm. You've listed several that are used. I wondered if I could ask about Russian, Chinese, perhaps Farsi.
Yeah, so I'm talking here in my statement just now. I was talking about largely the American and European tech companies and what journalism grounding data and training data they are using officially, right? So the licensing deals which they've struck with an Axel Springer or Associated Press, those are largely English, and there's a couple of European languages in there as well. Of course, they do crawl for data across many, many news organizations around the world, in many cases without permission or without compensation. And there's also a lot of machine translated text from different languages into English. I think that what we've seen is that the Chinese and Russian and other states are actually using the gaps in other languages and using the hunger that tech companies have to fulfill grounding and training requirements to increase their databases, their data sets, to actually fill that with disinformation. I think that there's also, I mean, we can talk about, you know, the other training models that are being built in China and in Russia and so on, in particular in China, and their own data sets, but they're of course a lot more opaque than, even more opaque, I should say, than the American models.
Okay, thank you. Afra.
Thank you for setting out so comprehensively the challenges for global media freedoms. You are the CEO and co-founder of the International Fund for Public Media Interest. I wondered if you could set out a bit about the work that the organisation does to promote global media freedoms and counter disinformation.
Sure. And it's public interest media, as in media that serves the public interest. So the International Fund for Public Interest Media is the first and to date the only multilateral financing mechanism for journalism globally. So our primary function is to provide funding for independent journalism in the global south and also in Eastern Europe. We are funded by 10 states, including France, Sweden, Australia, Ghana recently made a commitment, the first African country to make a commitment, Estonia, a number of others, as well as foundations like the Ford Foundation and Illuminate, and certain companies as well. Our goal is to create a truly multilateral coalition. We have 20 donors in total, and they're growing all the time. A truly multilateral coalition that can actually take on some of the threats we're seeing around disinformation and ensure that media outlets have the funding to do independent reporting, but also have the funding to actually invest in evolving. You know, obviously with AI and with the political threats facing journalism, media outlets need to actually invest in new ways of reaching audiences. And it's very difficult for them to do that when they don't have the funding required even to pay their reporters and do the basics of journalism. And so, you know, we've supported 122 media organizations across 31 countries, Latin America, Africa, Asia, Pacific Islands, Eastern Europe, and so on. I'll give you one example of one of our larger programs, which is in Moldova. So over the last 2 years, we've supported 10 news outlets in Moldova. We put in just 2.3 million euros over that time. These include the top 5 news outlets, as ranked by the Independent Journalism Center there, as well as, you know, a number of other really innovative news outlets like Diaz, which are doing kind of social media first and youth engagement based on independent reporting. And we've had some terrific success stories there. For example, Zero de Garda, which is the kind of paper of record in Moldova, the largest newspaper circulation, did deep investigative journalism stories. Serving Moscow was their prize-winning story, which uncovered Russian influence in Moldova, you know, Russian vote buying, as well as you know, money being paid to politicians and so on. That was a great story. It helped inform the people of Moldova. It also increased their circulation by about 30%, which is a very profitable exercise for them and helped them be more relevant and increase their own reporting ability, especially outside of the capital. So that's the kind of funding that we do to both ensure that power is being held to account and ensure that news outlets have more money to invest in serving the public.
I mean, given the kind of funding challenges, and obviously you've set out the work that you're doing and where the countries that are providing funding, how important or to what extent do you think there's a need for a dedicated multilateral initiative to fund independent journalism in order to combat FEMI and create a resilient information space? but also where there are initiatives that fund perhaps other initiatives like the G7, NATO, EU, how are you making sure that you're not duplicating some of the efforts that they are going to?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I mean, we created the International Fund because we felt that there was a huge gap in terms of actually providing core financial support to newsrooms. There are some really important other multilateral efforts. Of course, the Media Freedom Coalition, which the UK created back in 2019. There's the Global Media Defence Fund, which focuses on, as you know, on journalist safety. There isn't another multilateral effort that focuses on providing funding for journalism. So we are really addressing the economic challenges of viability, financial viability for media outlets, which are increasing, and also which are, many autocrats know that this is a tool that can be used against media outlets. I mean, in Georgia, the Foreign Agents Law was created in order to try and stop funding to media outlets. In India, foreign funders are not allowed to fund journalism because it starves them of oxygen. In the Philippines, Duterte tried to stop the funding lines to Rappler, the key source of independent news, because it starves them of their ability to keep working. So, actually this is an active battle to try and ensure funding exists, and there wasn't any multilateral fund or initiative that directly provided funding. And journalist safety and regulation and other pieces are crucial, but and they're served by other entities. So firstly, we think it's crucial, which is why we started it, and it's pretty unique in that way. Secondly, these challenges to independent news and the challenges of disinformation are so great that I don't think it's really possible for one state or even one company to tackle them alone. We're talking about immensely powerful forces, whether it's Elon Musk or whether it's the Russian propaganda network and the budget that they put behind it. I mean, Russia, we estimate, spends about 1.5 billion every year on propaganda outside its own borders. China is several orders of magnitude higher than that. In total, some years it reaches $8 to $10 billion. The entire OECD combined spends less than $500 million. That was in 2023, spent less than $500 million. So the entire 33 OECD countries spend less than a third of what Russia spends. Since USAID was shut down, we estimate another $200 million loss. So that number's down to 300 million. So really, unless one single country can massively up their budget, which I know that's not the climate right now, then it's actually not really possible for individual states to tackle these threats, whether they're tech regulation or they're kind of the propaganda battle we're facing. It's much more cost effective to tackle these things as a group, especially given shared goals.
Thank you.
Claire.
Thank you. I'm going to come to talk a little bit more about the effect of this in the UK. But first of all, could you just outline a little bit more about what are the threats? What is it in Russia for Russia to be spending so much money on this? What are they hoping to achieve, and what's the problem with all of this? I mean, I can understand it, but if you can just maybe outline a bit more. You've talked about propaganda thrives, autocratic power consolidates. Can you say a little bit more about what the bad outcomes of this are?
Yes, absolutely. So I think there's two or three kind of primary impacts. I mean, the first and highest level goals, I think, are around the destabilization of democracies and the destabilization of multilateralism and kind of joint action. So, for example, Russia's, after Ukraine, Russia has spent more in terms of disinformation in France than in any other country. And if you look at the stories that are being funded, they're around smear campaigns against Macron and his family, they are anti-immigrant campaigns, and they are campaigns in support of the kind of rising right-wing power in France. And you know, that pattern has been repeated in other countries, but I think it's no coincidence that's happening with a leader that is promoting kind of European solidarity and multilateralism, because it's a divide and conquer strategy. I think that in other parts of the world, I mean, to go back to Moldova, for example, there's very specific goals around Russian power. So in the Transnistria region, for example, there is no independent media at all. It's a separatist region of Moldova, and there's a ton of Russian capital going in to support, you know, everything from public services to kind of politicians' pay packets. And so there it's really about Russian expansion of power, you know, on its borders. But I think, you know, really where we're seeing, certainly in European countries, we're seeing Russia try to destabilize and fracture intergovernmental cooperation, and pretty successfully in most cases.
Very concerning. So what in your experiences, what are the main actors responsible for transnational repression of journalism in the UK? What are their tactics?
So there's a couple I think I'd call out. One is quite simply paying for content and paying for influencers to spread false narratives. And so we're seeing, you know, a pretty sophisticated network of you know, individuals being paid to further, again, anti-immigrant narratives and to support political campaigns, formal or otherwise, that can actually oppose existing power structures. What we're seeing in other parts of the world, less so the UK, is actual investment in buying up media houses. So, for example, all across Africa, there's been extraordinary Chinese investment in terms of equity and ownership of independent newsrooms, including in South Africa, which, you know, typically has had a very, very good record on media freedom, and using these assets as kind of to be activated around elections or around particular destabilization campaigns, or around campaigns to actually acquire natural resources. So, you know, and of course, there are some protections in the UK against ownership, which I think have been helpful, but I think financial influence is still there.
Who is doing that? Is it the state actors that we've been talking about?
Yes, primarily.
Up to now?
Yeah.
Russia, China and Iran? Those are three that have been mentioned in previous panels.
Yes.
So who would you say?
My knowledge is weaker.
UK?
My knowledge is weaker on Iran, but certainly Russia and China.
Mm-hmm. And the committee has received evidence calling from the UK to place China on the enhanced tier of the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme. Do you think this is necessary in the context of combating transnational repression of journalism?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's long overdue.
And do you think there's more that could be done? What other advice would you give?
In terms of protecting the UK's
Yes.
news infrastructure?
Yeah. What would be the best things that we could do here in the UK?
I think that as I've mentioned, we've seen more than 250 news outlets and news titles go out of business in the UK over the last 15 years. And, you know, I mean, my local newspaper, the Cardiff Echo, went out of business a few years ago. And I think that leaves a huge gap in terms of local reporting. We saw it in Stockport as well, in terms of facts being delivered quickly to the communities in which they're situated. So I think, you know, and there are countries, including Canada, France, Luxembourg, who've actually got pretty sophisticated domestic news subsidies that allow local news to stay afloat. And I think that would be an important addition to think about here in the UK.
Bill. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Lalwani, you've mentioned Georgia twice, and in that context, I just wanted to reflect that in 2023, the previous US administration provided, by my reckoning, $144 million worth of support through US aid, of which $3.5 million was for media and freedom of information support. Clearly, that agency was announced for closure by Secretary of State Marco Rubio in July of this year. How have those cuts to USAID impacted media freedoms globally, including perhaps if you could speak to countries such as Georgia, where we've seen government crackdowns on freedom of information and independent media operating in country?
I mean, they've had an enormous impact, and I don't think we've even seen the full extent of it yet. So we estimate that, again with OECD data, that the US provided about 21% of media support globally in terms of foreign aid budgets supporting media. And, you know, although they've been cut, those cuts are still flowing through the system because they supported, for example, Internews, who then also had big programs across Eastern Europe. So, as I mentioned, we estimate that it's between 30 and 50% between 50 and 70%, excuse me, of revenue to outlets across Eastern Europe that has been cut because of USAID. They were the main donor there. That plus the fact that the government has consolidated power and has made it illegal for, you know, external funders to fund media. It has forced many Georgian media organizations into exile over the last 6 to 12 months, means that there's much less accountability in terms of government actions in Georgia. And there's, I mean, clearly a huge and deepening reliance on Russian power and capital to support kind of the aims of you know, Russian expansion into the EU. So when we look at the countries across Eastern Europe, I think many consider Georgia to be a case of we did sort of too little too late in terms of supporting truly independent journalism. Even when USAID was around, you know, a few million a year is, and not all of that going directly into the reporting budgets of media organizations was insufficient.
And how has that announced closure of USAID impacted your work, particularly in the International Fund?
Yeah, so I mean, USAID was our biggest donor overall, and you know, last month at the Paris Peace Forum, we secured an additional 10 million euro commitment from France. Once we receive that, you know, France will be the biggest donor to the fund over time, but still, we did lose an enormous source of both capital and kind of ongoing budgetary support for the fund. That's made fundraising, you know, and support for our grantees particularly difficult. And, you know, many of them have both lost direct support or, you know, support that was, you know, coming from the US government. And we've also had to cut back on our support as well. We've honored all existing grant commitments, and we've, you know, prioritized Eastern Europe in our grant making. Given some of the geopolitical threats and given how reliant they were on USAID. But unfortunately, you know, there are not many countries in the world right now that are increasing their support for media. I think France is an exception, despite their budget cuts and their foreign aid cuts as well. They have increased their support. So it'll be around 24 million overall that they've supported us with when we get this new commitment, but very other few countries around Europe are doing this.
Thank you. And how will the proposed cuts to the UK overseas development grants impact media freedoms globally? So we've talked about the US cuts. What's your assessment of the UK reduction?
I think they're very concerning. If you look at OECD data, our analysis is that the UK, since 2019, since the Global Media Freedom Conference that was hosted here, the UK has already cut $30 million of funding in terms of foreign aid spend on media. And any further cuts, especially given the broader and geopolitical environment, will be tremendously damaging to the sector. The UK has historically been one of the leaders of supporting media freedom and journalism, as evidenced by, the creation of the Media Freedom Coalition. There are a couple of other states, including the Nordic countries, which do this, but really, I think the UK's role is pretty unique, and further cuts here would, I'm not sure which other countries could even begin to step up. Yeah.
Do you have any further breakdown of the 30 million of cuts? Which were the main countries which UK was focusing its support in terms of media freedom?
So I'm looking at the OECD tracker over that time. I'm not sure I actually have that data here, but I could write in with it, if that's okay.
That would be very helpful. So you talked at the beginning about the 20 donors who've come together in a coalition.
Yeah.
Is that in response to these cuts, to bring together other countries that are prepared to do that funding, to bridge some of the gap? And what will be the remaining gaps, do you think, and any particular countries that will be? You've highlighted Eastern Europe as where your funding priorities are. Is that where you're seeing the main gaps?
Yeah, so we created the International Fund in 2022, which is obviously long before the current US administration or the cutting of US aid. We did it then because we felt that we needed to radically increase the amount of funding available for journalism. We saw, the economic threats of journalism to have existed for 20 years. They've accelerated recently. The political threats have certainly accelerated in the last 10 years. And so even before USAID, we saw a huge need to increase the amount of funding. Our goal then was to go from 0.3% of foreign aid to about 1% of foreign aid, which would have introduced an extra $1 billion or so of funding for journalism globally. Unfortunately, we're going the other way. And so, the cuts since the beginning of the year have created an additional $200 million shortfall versus this time last year. And realistically, I don't really see how even that gap is going to be covered through OECD states. There are countries like Spain and Qatar also who have taken more of an active role in trying to support journalism and democracy, but it won't be to that extent. And so, I think we're relying on countries who have a track record of doing this, of supporting both multilateralism and supporting journalism and democracy, to, even if they can't to cover that gap, to do what they can in terms of financial support to media, and also become political champions to ensure that, countries that haven't historically supported these sectors to step in, or even companies that haven't historically supported these sectors to step in, because there is a huge need for the private sector to get involved. And our funding coalition is pretty diverse. We have countries like Taiwan, New Zealand, Estonia, who financially supported the fund. Ghana, I mentioned last month, made a financial commitment. And so we're looking at really expanding the kind of typical multilateral actors, or those who've supported multilateralism, to a much broader base, both because we need a broader coalition right now, because the threats are so vivid, but also because of the financial constraints for facing each individual state.
Thank you very much.
Can I just check, Mr. Lalwani, that the 30 billion of cuts, was that 30 million pounds of cuts?
It's dollars, because the OECD counts in dollars, yeah.
Right, got it, okay.
Yeah.
And so you've offered to write to us about the effect of those UK cuts on media freedom in recipient countries. And I should add, if there's anything else that you didn't cover today that you feel that you should that you'd like to give evidence to the committee on, then please just add that in writing as well. But that just leaves me to say thank you very much, Mr. Lalwani, for giving us evidence today.